Hello and welcome to this session. My name is Catherine Hayward and I am a project officer at UIIN, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about participation and co-creation for urban challenges. So today we'll be having a look at a general introduction to the concepts, and then we'll focus on how we can include stakeholders into our efforts. So we'll focus more first on a commercial aspect of including stakeholders through participatory design. Then we'll take one step further from participation and move on to looking at co-creation, and then we'll focus more on co-creation for urban challenges, which is what we're all really looking forward to hear about. So I thought this quote was very relevant. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's really what participation and co-creation is about. So it's about including others into our work so that we can get more viewpoints and we can reach more people and be more effective in everything we want to do. Because we all know that even though teamwork is sometimes challenging, it is very important to get input of others into our work. So why do we want to include stakeholders when we make decisions and when we implement these decisions? And that's because change doesn't happen in a vacuum. And if we look at the image on the left, we can all bounce ideas off each other, but if we all only have one point of view, we'll always only come up with the same solution. So if we look more at the picture on the right, we can see that bringing ideas from the outside is also very important, so that we can get different viewpoints and we can get different ideas and new ideas from others. And this is really how we foster innovation. So some good reasons for including stakeholders in your work is really getting a look at the views and concerns of others, getting their ideas for solutions, learning from their first-hand experiences. And when we include others into our work, we are able to get a better definition of the problem that we are trying to solve. So while we go through this, maybe in the back of your mind, keep the thought of the urban challenges that you are looking at during this course. And also think about, for now, we'll look at a commercial sense, so you can even think about this as a product or a service that's being created. So what is the problem that your product or service wants to solve? And then we'll also later on look a bit more at this from the perspective of your urban challenge. So that problem definition will come up again and again, and it's very important that you have defined the correct problem before you start trying to solve it. So when we include these stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, we get a better definition of the problem at hand. Stakeholders also, they take ownership of the problem and they feel represented when we bring them into decision-making processes. We earn their trust, and this often ends in greater satisfaction of the solutions that are implemented. So stakeholders often feel more attached, they feel more open to the solution that is being implemented in the end. On the other hand, it's good to consider what happens if we don't include stakeholders in decision-making processes. So if you think about a product and you think about the issue that you're trying to solve with this product, you may end up solving the wrong issue. You may end up solving the wrong problem with the creation of your product or service. And if you don't get those external viewpoints that we've mentioned, if you don't know your end user, you might not know exactly what the issue is that they are facing. And this will lead to dissatisfaction with any decisions that are made or actions that are implemented. So potentially the stakeholders may feel like they don't own that solution anymore. They don't feel attached to it, so they are dissatisfied with the solution that is created. And that can also lead to the solution not even being implemented or pushback against the solution that is implemented. So how can we include stakeholders into our efforts? And we'll have a little bit of a look now at participatory approaches to including stakeholders. There are three main approaches that we'll touch on today. There are many more approaches, but I want us to think of this kind of as an evolution along a scale. So we start off with the first approach as service design, then to lead user approach and participatory design. And as we go through them, you'll see how they kind of build upon one another. Starting with stakeholder participation, we'll start at the bottom level as service design. And the main concept of service design is ideate, design, and implement. But this is no longer enough. These three steps are no longer enough to provide meaningful output and create meaningful value. So what is service design? The concept is really about ideation phase, where we think about what we want to create, the designing phase of how do we create this product or this service or this solution, and then the implementation phase, so putting it into practice. And these phases are really now only considered the start of value creation. But what is special about service design, as opposed to going through these stages on your own as one single entity without external input, is that the experiences of people and the needs of others are considered in the ideate and the design phases. So there is some stakeholder consultation in these phases. So they speak about, they look at the needs of people and they include others into the design phase. There is some degree of engagement in these two phases. The next step of our pyramid, so to speak, would be the lead user approach. And this is where the end user actually creates the product or the service before the producer does. And I think a really nice example of this is the mountain bike. We're here in the Netherlands, and that's where I'm talking to you from, so bicycles are very close to our hearts. And mountain bike enthusiasts in the beginning, there were no mountain bikes, there were only road bikes. And there were a group of people who really enjoyed biking on rougher terrain. They enjoyed biking down mountains or on cross-country paths. So these people ended up building their own bicycle, and they therefore fulfilled their own needs. And it took a little while, and then bicycle producers realized that there was a need for these types of bicycles, and then only started producing mountain bikes. So this is really where the end user leads the production of a product or a service or the development of a solution. And if we look back at service design was more of the producer having the idea, but just including input from external parties and from the end users, where this is really the end user taking the initiative from the beginning and then the producer picking that up. What we've all been waiting for, participatory design. Now we are really getting further on in the evolution of participation of stakeholders into our service, product and service development and solution design. So Burr said that design and development processes in which end users are invited to participate and contribute, where they are not simply critics and evaluators, but also co-designers. So they don't only, for example, in service design, they're not just giving their input into the various phases, they're actually co-designing and co-developing with the producers. And this is a means of better understanding, meeting, and sometimes preempting needs of stakeholders. And what really sets this participatory design apart is that end users are included in the initial discovery and ideation phases. So this is kind of a take on lead user approach, where they're really starting off creating the designs or creating the solutions for themselves. Then they also take an active role in co-designing solutions. So it's also the ideation phase in which they're involved, the design phase as well. And then it's not just designing for them, but designing together, designing with the end user in mind, and them giving input constantly. So here we have again our evolution from service design to participatory design. And just to remind ourselves, we've really come from this ideate, design and implement phase to stakeholders providing their input and solutions from the start. So they are the ones who kind of start the process, but then the producer picks that up and carries it off. And then where participatory design, where stakeholders create and design their solutions in collaboration with the producers. A nice case study of this participatory design is a case from the University of Barcelona, and I'm sure we all have COVID-19 still fresh in our minds, and we know that although a lot of activities had to stop, a lot of things still had to keep moving, and there was still a need for certain services and products to be created. So in this example, of course, medical needs don't really go away despite a larger crisis. And what a team of engineers did at the University of Barcelona is they made sure that they were efficient in their production of medical materials by contacting medical staff and consulting them on what they needed through Telegram groups. And then the medical staff they would first identify the need, get input from the medical staff, and for example through photos on these Telegram groups, and then only create what was needed. So this was a really efficient and participatory means of creating these medical supplies that were needed. We might be feeling all very inspired now and wanting to run off and implement participatory design in our projects, but we've got to the phase, we've gone through different phases, and now we've thought about designing a product or designing a service or a solution, but what happens after we've designed it? Someone has to use that solution has to be implemented. And is there something more? Is there a next step? Is there a step past participatory design? And yes, there is. It's called co-creation. And if we put them side by side, participatory design is where stakeholders create and design in collaboration with the producers, where co-creation is about implementation. So in participatory design, we haven't mentioned the implementation phases yet. And that's because co-creation is really where this more holistic, all-encompassing approach comes in. So Mahmoud describes co-creation as a process that stands out for the engagement of stakeholders and end users throughout the whole process of decision-making and implementation. That's really important, the implementation. And it achieves a more complete shared governance model. So we have much more input, we have much more, many more feelings of ownership around governance, and as mentioned, the ownership as well of the solutions that are being proposed, or the products or the services that are created. So what are the main differences between participatory design and co-creation? So in participatory design, people are the end users, they're the consumers, where in co-creation they're really seen as proactive citizens. And participatory design is more for short-term issues and outcomes, where co-creation is that holistic culture change. For participatory design, participants are usually recruited to take part in something that already exists. So I, as the producer, may already have an idea. Where in co-creation, participants are included completely from the beginning of the process, and they are often supported to develop their own initiatives as well. So it's kind of self-sustaining. So yes, like I mentioned, it's developing and implementing the plan. And of course, we need genuine participation for co-creation to happen, and so that everyone can take action, which is the action and the implementation, which is really what is important, especially going forward when we talk more about urban challenges. Some of the characteristics of co-creation: it's systemic, it's across the entire value chain, it starts, as we mentioned, from the beginning, ideation, to implementation. It's innovative and productive, so it generates new products, new services, new ideas, new innovations. It's diverse, so citizens aren't just passive. They are active. They are forming a partnership. And that also leads on to this hierarchy flattening, where government and citizens and other stakeholders, such as businesses or NGOs, they share power. So the governance comes from everybody. It's not just top-down. It's bi-multidirectional, which also leads to idea and information flow among stakeholders, knowledge sharing, and so that everyone can learn and grow. It's iterative. There are co-creative techniques, and these increase the frequency and the amount of information that's exchanged between the stakeholders. It benefits, hopefully, everyone, but it's mutually beneficial, and as we mentioned as part of other characteristics, stakeholders learn from each other, and participants assist others to improve the community in the long term. So in the previous slide, we also spoke about culture change, and this is also very intrinsic. And lastly, trust is very important in these co-creational activities. Trust and equal opportunity to participate. So everyone has an opportunity, whether they take it or not, to participate, but everyone has an equal opportunity. Now we get to your urban challenges. So how is all of this relevant for tackling urban challenges? Well, it's directly applicable. What better way to look at urban challenges than through living labs? And living labs really take on co-creation as a methodology for experimentation. An example that is really relevant for the work that you're doing in this program is urban living labs. And these are defined as spaces designed for interactions between a context and a research process. So in your case, your context would be your city or your town, where we test, develop, and apply social practices or technologies to a building or infrastructure due to their focus on co-creation through experimentation. So it's really bringing the research into a real-life context. It's getting that input from stakeholders. It's co-creation. That is how the experiment, it doesn't sound so nice to experiment on people, but that is how the research is done, with direct input from the stakeholders, from the citizens who live there, from those people, the end users, so to say, the people who are going to be most affected. And there are three main dimensions of urban living labs, and that is their geographical embeddedness. So in our case, we think of our city, for example. We experiment in a real life chamber, which is the city, experimentation and learning approach, and participation and end user involvement as partnerships. So it's the place, the research, and the people involved. And urban living labs, that is something very important about them, is that they integrate people into the entire development process as users and co-creators. When facilitating co-creation processes in urban living labs, the first step is really to consider who the stakeholders are, the important stakeholders, and map them. So thinking about who is the target audience, who's the end user, who's going to be affected by the decisions that are being made. So that also makes you think about who to include in the process. Of course, it's impossible to include everybody who will be affected, but you really need to think about who are the most important people to involve. And then also different ways of involving people, so through workshops, focus groups, meetings, etc. Really activities that facilitate co-creative processes, that facilitate knowledge exchange, and then of course co-creation spaces, so physical structures, virtual hubs. How are you going to collaborate, co-create? So we think, who is involved, how do we involve them, and where do we do it? Now that we know a little bit more about where we want to create our urban living lab, who we want to include in the process, we can also think about using or including stakeholders in different ways. So there are non-participatory methods of including stakeholders, and there are participatory methods of including stakeholders. And for the most part, we've been focusing more on the participatory methods, but when we think about it, sometimes there are different extents to which we want to include stakeholders in processes. So, for example, we might just want to inform them or consult them. This is not a participatory method, but it sometimes is the most efficient and useful way to engage your stakeholders. But we're looking more right now at the participatory methods, and this is involving them, collaborating with them, and empowering them. And co-creation really aims to do these three things: involve, collaborate, and empower the stakeholders, because of course, as we've mentioned many times, the empowerment really lies with the implementation of the solutions that are developed. And some ideas for you to think of how to involve your stakeholders, going from non-participatory to participatory methods, and, for example, informing your stakeholders through a newsletter or a website, consulting them, getting their feedback through questionnaires or focus groups, involving them in workshops, developing a stakeholder decision-making committee, holding a decision-making event where you can collaborate with your stakeholders, or developing a task force made up of stakeholders. And this is really the most participatory method in which they themselves are empowered. They make the decisions, they push the initiative forward. If we think about different co-creation processes, because we've been speaking about co-creation so much, it kind of encompasses different aspects. So there are different processes within co-creation in which you can include your stakeholders. And these include co-design, where you have the stakeholders be the main decision makers and you design together the solutions. Co-implementation, where stakeholders are really at the center of the implementation process, and we of course know that implementation is a very important part of co-creation. There's co-management, so the maintenance and the sustainability of the project and the monitoring of the solutions is really kept up by the stakeholders. And then of course co-development, where stakeholders then can can then kind of have this multiplier effect where they replicate the solutions in other places and others get inspired by what is being done. And this really fosters a shared governance where it's more of a flat hierarchy, as we've already mentioned earlier in these slides, where citizens are not just being told what to do, they're really taking action themselves. And this shared governance serves as a negotiation mechanism for formulating and implementing policies. So you're really allowing your stakeholders to have their say in the development of policy and actively involving them in that. Also, this allows for consensus. So when stakeholders are involved, they're more likely to agree, or you're more likely to reach consensus on a desirable solution. And the characteristics of this shared governance, where it's not just a top-down approach, it's really more of a flat hierarchy or a bottom-up approach to governance. It's really flexible and inclusive, and anyone who wants to participate is able to. So there's no barrier to entry, and it really allows for those people who want to be involved, who feel very strongly about a certain cause, to step up and take action themselves. The AMS Institute in Amsterdam is a very nice practical example of an urban living lab. And here the living lab is really used to collect information and data, and that could be from many different sources, including citizens themselves. It's used to facilitate expertise and knowledge sharing from different academic fields, as well as that knowledge exchange between researchers and citizens. It's used to test and evaluate different tools within the living environment, so for example within the city. And what's really interesting and valuable is that of the around 90 projects that take place, more than 50% include citizen participation. And you can see here from the image on the left that more than half of the projects are actually about implementation. So the users, the citizens, the stakeholders are really involved in the implementation of the projects, which is really key, as we know, for co-creation. And one of the very nice projects that have come out of the AMS Institute is Hemelswasser, which is a beer that is being produced using rainwater. And Joris Huber is the owner, the founder of this process to create beer. And Joris found some partners. So, for example, a hotel collects rainwater, and there is a local brewery which then produces the beer from this rainwater. And now this process has been commercialized, and they really use this product to increase awareness of the importance of collecting rainwater, storing rainwater, and they are making a case to increase the storage capacity of rainwater in the city. So in the end, what does all of this mean for you and your project? So you can think of your project as a small-scale urban living lab, and if you follow the co-creation principles for designing and implementing solutions to urban challenges, you can do this even on the singular level of your own project. And you really start with co-defining the challenge with your community, getting stakeholders in, getting end users in, and getting their input to define what is the challenge that needs to be faced. And then you can also design your own urban living lab space. You can you can also look back on this presentation and see the steps you need to take to define how and how often you interact with your stakeholders, what level of engagement you want to achieve with them. So do you want to take a participatory approach, a non-participatory approach? Do you want to take a co-creation approach? How are you going to interact with your stakeholders? Then understanding the co-creation processes, you need to think about what mechanisms you can involve the community in co-design, co-implementation, co-management, co-development. So you can speak to your supervisor about this. How can you cost effectively involve your community? And there are inexpensive ways to do this. There are time efficient ways to do this as well. And then thinking about how you can establish shared governance from the implementation of your ideas, from the implementation of the process. And then also thinking about who you should work with to ensure the sustainability of your solution. So who's going to sustain that solution? Who's going to carry it on and help it grow and maintain it? That's something you really have to think about from the beginning, from the initiation of your project. So you can also take a different approach. So instead of coming up with your own theoretical living lab, you can also embed your project into existing living labs in your city. So you can find some synergies between those living labs in your city and your own project. You can look through often universities will have living labs, sometimes independent research centers, so you can have a look at that and get them involved with your idea. And of course, following our Urban Good Camp course, and there are more modules that will be available online besides just this one, so really have a look at that and help that give you some inspiration. Looking a little bit further afield for some inspiration, there's a really nice example from the University of New South Wales in Australia, where a group of students went to remote parts of Fiji to set up some solar solutions for the citizens there. And here the challenge was to think about technically and financially viable and sustainable solutions. So these are solutions that the communities can continue on their own. These citizens can implement this and maintain this equipment on their own. So some of the challenges were that the citizens had limited capacity to maintain the equipment, and that trained maintenance staff were very far away because of the remote location of these villages. So how did they ensure that the community got what they needed? And that was through co-creation, participation. They really troubleshooted with the community and found out what the needs of the community are and what their capabilities are. And I think this was a really nice quote from one of the students to say, a key learning has been the importance of engineering design with people in mind. That is so crucial. It's all about the people that are involved, people who are going to benefit from the solutions and maintain and sustain them. Now that we've gone through the content a little bit and you may be feeling like you have a better understanding of how to include stakeholders in your project, I encourage you to really think about what we've gone through today and what this means for the development of your project. I encourage you to really reflect on what you've seen here today, and a few thinking points for your project at the moment would be, who would you include in the process? So who are the important stakeholders for your urban challenges? Is there any way to integrate these mechanisms that you've seen here today into your own project? So do you see a role for participation and co-creation? Do you see a role for taking an urban living lab approach? And then also, do you know of any examples of participatory design or co-creation in your own city? Maybe you can link your project to an example such as an urban living lab or a research center in your own city. So I really encourage you to think about these when developing your project. I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention today, and it was a pleasure to present this module, and I hope that you benefit from what was mentioned, and that you can really enhance your projects through what you've learned here today.